the topic uniting us here today. We want to talk about how the United Nations can leverage the ideas, the innovation, and also the creativity of young people, and how can we, the United Nations Youth Delegate, use our voices inside the UN system to create change for the good of all. At the outset, we therefore really want to thank the delegation of the European Union and the Office of the Envoy on Youth for convening this dialogue. We welcome your commitment to engage with youth delegates, especially at a time when their access to the United Nations remains limited due to COVID-19 restrictions. I'm Franka Weckner, I'm the German Youth Delegate to the United Nations, and I'm here with my co-moderator, Mariam Siar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's event. I'm Mariam Siar, a youth activist from Afghanistan. As Franka already mentioned, we are here after 2 years of the pandemic, trying to build back better and ensure that the voices of the youth are systematically integrated across the United Nations system. We are therefore very happy to have this platform for the United Nations Youth Delegate and representative to share their experiences, questions, as well as their expertise. This exchange will focus on the implementation of the Secretary General's report entitled Our Common Agenda, and will provide a platform for all youth delegates to interact with the United Nations and the member states' senior leaders in two intergeneration thematic discussion outlining their priorities and exploring answers and solutions to some of the most important questions. After these exchanges, the UN Youth Delegates will have the opportunity to showcase their recommendations for the way forward.
And we're joined by fantastic speakers tonight, and therefore we would like to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union, and also the co-host for tonight, for his welcoming remarks. Thank you very much. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Franka, and thank you very much, Mariam. Good morning from New York, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, distinguished youth delegates. I'm Olaf Skog. I'm the EU ambassador here at the United Nations. I'm not a youth, but I am an activist. I strongly believe that we need to do much more to counter the major global challenges, from climate change to inequalities to human rights, and that youth needs to have a much stronger voice in the way on how we get to that goal. It's my pleasure to welcome you for the third committee Youth Delegates Dialogue, which I'm co-hosting with Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, Yayatma Wikoramayake. Ongoing COVID-19 restrictions have hampered youth participation at the UN in the past year and a half. This dialogue is a way to ensure that youth delegates continue to have a seat at the table. I'd like to thank all high-level guests for taking the time to join the discussion. The event is an example of a UN initiative by, for, and with young people. It's the result of a significant amount of brainstorming, consultations, and collaborative work that youth delegates from different continents undertook together over the past few weeks. I'd like to take this opportunity to commend youth delegates for their engagement, and I look forward to hearing much more about your reflections. In the UN 75 political declaration, member states recognize that effective decision-making for a sustainable future cannot take place without the participation of young people, and that we must listen to and work with youth. The Secretary General reiterated this commitment in his report, Our Common Agenda, issued 2 months ago, where he made forward-looking recommendations, such as upgrading the office of the Youth Envoy to a full-fledged youth office and setting up an envoy for future generations. We commend the inclusive process that led to the presentation on Our Common Agenda, which ensured the participation of young people and civil society. And we must have a similar open and inclusive way forward to prepare the various summits proposed by the Secretary General, and which we support, most notably the Summit for the Future. Today's discussion is a step in that direction and an opportunity to hear at first feedback from youth delegates on these important proposals and discuss their implementation. Young people are not only the future, they are also the present. As the world meets in Glasgow this week for COP26, the impact of the youth movement in the defense of climate and a healthy environment is one of the many concrete examples of young people's contributions. Yet, young people continue to face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and other specific challenges, which limit their ability to act and be heard. Let me reaffirm the EU's unconditional support for the full, equal, and meaningful participation of young people in all their diversity, including women and girls, as well as youth with disabilities, indigenous youth, LGBTI youth, migrants, refugees, and members of minority groups. Young people are key agents of change. So again, I look forward to listening to recommendations on how to better engage youth, ensuring stronger partnerships and working together for our common objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. We are now delighted to show a video message by His Excellency Abdullah Shahid, the President of the United Nations General Assembly, who will deliver the keynote speech.
Your Excellencies, distinguished youth delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. The United Nations Youth Delegate Programme is a wonderful initiative, letting youth meaningfully participate in the General Assembly's work. I find it heartening that so many delegations make use of this opportunity to allow young voices to be heard, and I'm hopeful that more countries will follow their lead. Distinguished youth delegates, let us reflect that while the pandemic has taken a toll on all of us, it is you, the youth, that have the most at stake in our ongoing efforts to build back better. You will one day be stewards of the world we leave behind. You deserve to have a say in shaping your own futures. At 1.8 billion, today's youth demographic is the largest in history, expecting to inherit a world that is peaceful, sustainable, gender-balanced, just, and prosperous. To that end, I reiterate the calls made by the Secretary General in the Common Agenda for Member States to uphold their commitments, to listen to and work with you, and ensure that young people, including youth delegations, are included in the United Nations substantive work. Distinguished youth delegates, you might be surprised, but I have now been a young man for almost 6 decades. And I know firsthand the burning desire to engage and make a lasting difference. That is one of the reasons I'm so keen to take forward the Youth Fellowship Program, one of the flagship initiatives of my Presidency of Hope. This program will provide an opportunity for aspiring young diplomats and civil servants from SIDS, LDCs, and LLDCs to be a part of the United Nations. It is my hope that they will gain experiences and return home as torchbearers for strong international cooperation and diplomacy to ensure that the flame of multilateralism continues to burn bright. I hope that many of the youth delegates present here today will be a part of the Youth Fellowship Program, and I look forward to welcoming you on board. Let us never forget that the youth are among the most important constituents of our work. The youth will reap the benefits of or bear the consequences of what we do today. Let us do right by them. Let us build a world in which young people can realize their hopes and aspirations. And let us listen to and involve them as we build that world. I thank you.
Thank you very much for this inspiring keynote. We're now very happy to be joined by His Excellency Mr. Liu Zhenmin, Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. His Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Franca. Excellencies, distinguished youth delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues. I'm honored to join you today at this Youth Delegate side event. I thank the Youth Secretary General's Youth Envoy and the EU delegation for convening this event. I am glad to see that my good friend, Ambassador Olof Skog, is here today. I think a lot of them we are no longer young, but we're also grown up from the youth. So I think it's so delighted also for me to join the youth delegates at this event. UN DESA has been pleased to support the UN Youth Delegate Programme over the past years. I'd like to use this opportunity to share some information about the program. Over the last decade, young people's participation has flourished in the activities of the United Nations, the member states, and across the UN system. A solid commitment toward youth is evident in the priorities reflected in the 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development. This growing focus on youth is also reflected in an increasing number of member states sending youth delegates to the United Nations events. Indeed, over 70 UN youth delegates are participating this year at the UN General Assembly. DESA continue to actively reach out to countries yet to participate, especially from the global south. Dear colleagues, my colleagues in DESA are still working with the Secretary General whether he could really engage with you in the coming weeks. But unfortunately, he's very busy. He's traveling still now at COP26. Youth delegates have an exceptional platform for meaningful youth participation throughout their inclusion in the UN Youth Delegate Programme. Youth delegates are selected by their respective member states as a part of the official credentialed delegation to the United Nations, speaking on behalf of their governments, not in their personal capacity. This means that you have a unique role. You are different from civil society. You are also representing part of your country, your governments. The UN General Assembly encouraged member states to include youth delegates in their delegations at the relevant discussions in the General Assembly, ECOSOC, and its subsidiary bodies. It's up to member states concerned to decide on the selection, modalities, scope of participation of their youth delegates. Regarding the Secretary General's report on our common agenda, allow me to emphasize that my department, UN DESA, fully shares Secretary General's commitment and vision regarding young people and the medium for youth engagement. I noticed our colleague, Volker Turk, will share with you what the common agenda is intended to support the youth issue in the UN system. Protecting the integrity of UN Youth Delegate Programme has allowed it to flourish and expand, and as we have seen in recent years. For those of you here today who are UN Youth Delegates, I hope that you will continue your discussions in a productive manner, working with your member states, delegations, and contribute to concrete solutions. I hope that you will contribute to the follow-up of the common agenda on the youth issue. So whatever the reform process of UN Youth Programme will go, my department, UN DESA, is prepared to support youth by using its expertise, its knowledge, and experience of the department. I thank you for your attention. I wish you this event a great success. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We would now like to start with the first segment entitled Advancing Our Common Agenda, Youth Perspectives, which will be moderated by Jana, the United Nations Youth Delegate from Iceland, and Anya, the United Nations Youth Delegate from Albania.
Thanks, Miriam. Hello, everyone. It's with great pleasure and honor to be with you all today and discuss about a topic of great importance, like youth perspective and involvement in the implementation of Secretary General's report on our common agenda. My name is Anja Sauku, and I'm the Youth Delegate of Albania. And along with Jonna Petjushdotter, the Icelandic Youth Delegate, we will be moderating the first segment, where youth delegates and representatives will address and express their views and recommendations of the implementation of this agenda. I'd like to thank everyone for being part of this event, and to not waste any time, I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Jonna.
Thank you very much, Anja. I'm very honored to be here with you all today as the youth delegates from Iceland for this important discussion. For this first segment, we are very pleased to introduce Mr. Volker Turk, Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination, and Ms. Jayatma Vikramaniyaki, Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, who will both be available for reactions and responses to the statements and questions of youth delegates and representatives. On behalf of the youth delegates, we emphasize our gratitude to you all for taking the time to be here with us. So we will begin with the youth delegates delivering joint statements before we give Mr. Turk and Ms. Vikramaniyaki an opportunity to react. We will then move to a Q&A session moderated by my colleague Anja. I now give the floor to Swiss youth delegate Naji Osman for the first joint statement. You have the floor, Naji.
Thank you. Mr. Assistant Secretary General, Ms. Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, today, I have the honor to speak to you on behalf of the signatories of this joint statement, as well as on behalf of the youth those delegates represent. The Our Common Agenda report, as published by the Secretary General, identifies 12 areas of action, and we believe that youth involvement in the fulfillment and understanding of these areas is fundamental. Youth have been spearheading action in diverse areas of the 2030 Agenda. We have firsthand regarded the potential of youth, as can be seen through our role in fighting for sustainable climate action, as well as our position as advocates for the universal protection of human rights. Leaving no one behind and listening and working with youth are two of the commitments highlighted in the Our Common Agenda report. For these goals to be feasible, it requires the UN and its member states to recognize and harness the potential of youth worldwide. As UN Youth Delegates, we believe we are in a unique position to promote the genuine integration of youth as we take on a hybrid role. We are simultaneously knowledgeable about and work towards the ultimate goals of the United Nations, while we are also present figures within our respective borders as members of civil society that promote this organization's ethos and substantive undertakings. This makes us ideal vehicles to promote a more inclusive framework that enables meaningful, diverse, and effective participation of youth from the onset of actions. We are convinced that there is the opportunity for the creation, enhancement, and full utilization of synergies to make this possible. The engagement of youth ought to be a pillar embedded within the functioning of the United Nations, a sustainable and enduring mechanism that promotes meaningful participation as well as inclusive, transparent dialogues to enable genuine youth advocacy. Mr. Assistant Secretary General, Ms. Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, considering the fact that, as I mentioned, youth have an inherent potential, how do you plan to specifically harness this potential and make use of youth, especially UN Youth Delegates, in the implementation of the Our Common Agenda report? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naji, for this statement. I will now give the floor to Ms. Katri Leppäläkoso, Finland's youth delegate. The floor. Go ahead, Katri.
Thank you for giving me the floor. So today I'm honored to address this dialogue on behalf of youth representatives to the United Nations. As you know, we are gathered here today to discuss the importance of youth participation in achieving objectives outlined in our common agenda. While we welcome the efforts to integrate youth into the UN processes, we also face many challenges, one of which relates to lack of coordination and of youth-related issues. Although the UN Youth Envoy plays a vital role in addressing the needs and rights of young people, the problem with coordination is also partly reflected in her activities. We must address that separating the mandate of the UN Youth Envoy from the youth delegates has a direct impact on the participation of youth within the UN system. The Youth Delegate Programme involves more than 70 young people from around the world whose expertise could be better used in supporting Youth Envoy's objectives. The UN Secretary General has proposed the establishment of Youth Office in the Secretariat. If this office is to take place, engagement between the youth delegates and the Youth Envoy will be even more important in the future. We must address that young people have an essential role to play in coordinating policies that affect them, which is why we believe it is important this office will not only be youth-focused, but also youth-led. Meanwhile, we must bear in mind that without the support of the member states, the establishment of this office is unlikely to succeed. Hence, we want to ask you, what concrete steps are going to be taken in order to ensure a meaningful engagement between the youth envoy and youth delegates? And how can we ensure that also the states would be in favor of establishing a new youth office as suggested in our common agenda? We thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katri. I now turn to the senior leaders for their response and remark. If Mr. Turk would like to take the floor, please, for an allocated slot of 3 minutes before moving on to Ms. Vikremaniaki for her remarks. Mr. Turk, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Jona and Mariam, and also our two colleagues who have just spoken, Naji and Katri, and all the youth delegates for your fantastic work. And I just wanted to perhaps mention to you one thing that I think is very important to bear in mind in terms of the commitment from the UN side, and in particular the Secretary General and all of us working as part of his team. When we drafted our common agenda report, it was absolutely clear for us that one of the priorities has to be the focus on the aspirations, on the needs, on the rights of young people around the world. And in the preparation of the report, it was really important for us to make sure that the voices of young people feed into it. And as you know, there is an excellent report that was drafted over a couple of weeks earlier this year, our common future. And that really, you will see a lot of the ideas that were in that report found reflection in the final report of the Secretary General. And I think that shows, certainly from the side of the Secretariat, from the side also of the agencies, funds and programs, a very, very strong commitment. We are now at a critical phase. We're at a sensitive phase because now that the report has been launched, it's gone to the member states. They are currently discussing it. It's clear that when it comes, and I'm sure Chayatma is going to talk about that, when it comes to the creation of the youth office, that's an extremely important aspect of it, but obviously it will require discussions with member states. But there are many other suggestions in the report as well that speak directly to your concerns and the interests of young people around the world. One is to ensure that there is a much stronger emphasis on making sure that young people can be part of political processes. We know that they're often excluded. Civic space issues around the world have also not been very much in favor of young people in some instances. It's really important to make sure that that political representation is there. The other aspect is, and that's our own internal recruitment process. The common agenda has already given some inspiration to our own human resource side to ensure that younger people can be recruited into the UN in a much more meaningful way, because at the moment you go through a very hierarchical system, but we also need to have the ability to recruit younger people at a much more senior level. So that's actually put in train. There are many other issues around education and vocational training and the future of work that you have raised, that we have listened to very carefully, and as a result, the Secretary General wants to hold a Transforming Education Summit next year, because education is almost the litmus test for so many things that we are all concerned by. And as a result, we very much hope that that summit will go ahead in the way that it's meant to be, but also really look at the world as a whole and identify the different obstacles that we have currently, including on the digital side. So from our perspective, assurance is that we want to walk the talk. We want to make sure that we listen, we meaningfully engage, that we keep very close contact as we go through the implementation or the follow-up to the common agenda on all aspects, and not just on education or work. It's also on climate, as we can just see at COP26 how important it is that young people have come in as a strong voice. You are a political force to reckon with when it comes to climate issues. And it's critical for us to, because the interests are aligned between what the UN is trying to achieve and what you're trying to make sure that the world listens to. And we would certainly want to be a very, very strong partner and working together as we go through the common agenda, because the common agenda ultimately is about your future, our future, and we can only do it together. So thank you very much also for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turk, for this insightful and constructive response. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Vikramaniaki for an allocated time slot of about 3 minutes as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, Yona. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And thanks to the Ambassador of EU for co-convening with me this Youth Delegate Dialogue for the second consecutive year as well. And I hope this is something that we could continue to do in the years to come. Thank you for the two statements before on the common agenda and some of the proposals and also questions you had on youth engagement. I think Volker already touched upon many of the points I wanted to say, so I will try to be brief. First of all, your comments regarding young people's full and meaningful and effective engagement in the implementation of these recommendations is very much noted, and this you can be sure that this is at the heart of our thinking on the implementation of the common agenda as well. As you know, the development of the common agenda also greatly benefited from inputs of young people. As Volker mentioned, one of the 4 tracks was young thinkers, and there was an impressive group of youth fellows who independently, with guidance from our side, but really independently, truly in a youth-led way, conducted their own consultations broadly, publicly with young people around the world, and presented through a report to the Secretary General called our Future Agenda that also greatly shaped our common agenda and its recommendations that are particularly on young people. The second point I wanted to mention is that we are not starting from scratch. You know, the Secretary General launched a youth strategy back in 2018, and a lot of the recommendations here in the common agenda are really, for me, youth strategy 2.0, or bringing what we are already doing in the UN system or what we are already trying to do in the UN system to a different level with more partnerships with young people and putting young people really at the driving seat. So moving away from programming for young people into programming by and programming with young people and designing those initiatives and implementing them with young people. So for me, it is important that we have these already existing tools and processes in place so that we have a way to channel your inputs and your concerns and your ideas and proposals also into these ongoing conversations. Now, on your specific questions on how do you plan to engage young people in the implementation of the recommendations, particularly the youth delegates, I think for us, you're one of our most important and strategic allies. As the Swiss youth delegate mentioned, you play this hybrid role of being government representatives and youth representatives at the same time. So you're really our biggest ally when it comes to translating the ideas, the values, the proposals in the common agenda to the broad youth constituencies in your countries, but also to help us get the support of your member states to welcome, to acknowledge, and to support the recommendations of the common agenda here at the headquarters level, of course, through resolutions, but most importantly at the country level, because the implementation of these recommendations will happen in countries. Second, I am tasked by the Secretary General in our common agenda to conduct meaningful youth engagement consultations to present to the General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, and the Security Council. So I plan to conduct very wide consultations with young people to channel their ideas and solutions for better meaningful engagement of young people in these bodies. So this is another way that you as youth delegates can participate on behalf of course, your delegations, but most importantly, on behalf of the young people of your country by carrying out also national dialogues and consultations that could feed into our work. Lastly, I would also encourage you to think beyond the youth-specific recommendations that are in the common agenda. So for an example, you asked about the youth office, but I think also, as Walter mentioned, the proposals around transformative, universal, quality, lifelong education, removing barriers to political participation, the youth political index that is being proposed, the recovery barometer that will track youth labor market outcomes, the creation of green and digital jobs for young people. I think these are very important areas that will also require your expertise and your mobilization and your engagement. So I will also take this opportunity to encourage you to look beyond the paragraphs on youth to really give a cross-cutting view of our common agenda and integrate your voices and your concerns and your recommendations in those. Lastly, on the point on the youth office, of course, I agree with you that the office should be led by a young person. And I also take this an opportunity to ask you to further support us through your member states, because we will need broad political support and also, I think, financial support for the sustainability of such office going forward. So I really look forward to working together with you and your governments in order to implement the recommendations that the SG has put forth in the common agenda, and particularly also including the establishment of a dedicated office for youth that will bring the work of my office into a more sustainable footing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vikram Manayake. We will now move to the second part of this segment, which is a Q&A session from various youth representatives, giving them each around 40 seconds to deliver their questions. We will collect their questions, and after all questions have been asked, we will give the floor to the senior officials for their reactions. We will be starting with Ms. Mariam Siar, Afghanistan youth activist. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anya. I will actually start with a very basic question. The statistics shows that hunger and starvation are growing globally, especially in developing countries. And over 85% of the 1 billion youth live in the developing countries. On the top of that, UNESCO reports 263 million globally not attending schools. And UNICEF says 250 million young people are living in war zones. These statistics shows that a lot of youth are hungry, uneducated, and living in war zones, while United Nations has been there for almost 73 years now. Therefore, the question arises, how will the United Nations make sure by implementation of the commitments of the common agenda, no youth will be left behind and no children will be left behind, because today's children are tomorrow's youth. On the top of that, to what extent the common agenda is practical? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariam. We will now be giving the floor to Ms. Winnie Nyandiga, the Kenya Commonwealth Youth Observer. Winnie, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we are having this conversation. So recently, the UNSG announced a call to action to increase jobs and provide universal social protection. As young people, we are in agreement with this, and we are so happy that actually the reference dwells more heavily on the negative impact of schools and by and large education. I mean, we are far behind on education financing and the projected numbers of out of school children, given the existing ones already, and those who will never return due to the pandemic. Accelerated action is needed. So my question is, who is taking responsibility for the accelerated action and for pushing that leaders be accountable to it? And then also, there is no current detailed plan for genuine participation in the development of the accelerator by democratically elected representative young people, especially from the lower income countries. So what steps are being taken to ensure that our critical voices get to add into this accelerator? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Winnie. We will now be giving the floor to Ms. Jimena Prada, the Costa Rica Youth Delegate. Jimena, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I would like to ask, in the common agenda, you said we need a new social contract. Which are, according to you, the main elements for for building a new social contract? Because we have three elements: inclusion, trust, and underlining what really matters. But what would you say are the main ones?
Thank you so much, Jimena. We will now be giving the floor to Maria Luz Gazal, UK youth activist. Maria, you can go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Maria Luz Casal, and I am representing an interdisciplinary group working with the UK mission. Collectively, we would like to thank you for giving us this space to amplify young people's voices. We all know youth participation is a right, and I'd like to think that everyone here believes that young people deserve to be heard. Speaking in front of UN figures, senior figures, and international delegates is a very privileged position to be in. Whilst it's an honor to be here, it's in our views that this demonstrates an issue with accessibility. From our experience, UN institutions are difficult to engage with. The most vulnerable, most marginalized voices in society, and those that suffer as a result of persecution are being left out of the international dialogue. So our question is, how can we ensure accessibility and diversity in the meaningful and sustained youth participation when implementing our common agenda? Thank you.
Thank you, Jimena. We will now be giving the mic to Mrs. Muzdalfa Ahmed, Pakistani Youth Delegate. Mrs. Muzdalfa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I believe the Secretary General's report on Common Agenda is a thoughtful call to re-embrace global solidarity and find new ways to work together. But my question is, how can this agenda deliver more for young people, especially those affected by long and festering conflict? As a youth delegate with Kashmiri roots, I too come from such a background. From the last 7 decades, our region has been reeling under illegal Indian occupation. Just in the last 2 years, 13,000 young Kashmiris have been tortured. As the voice of Kashmiri youth, I implore the international community to come forward and play its effective role. Hold India accountable for human rights violation in Jammu and Kashmir. Give Kashmiri their right of self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mustafa. I will now be giving the floor to Ms. Diandra Nibuhashala, Ireland Youth Delegate. Please, you can go ahead, Diandra.
Thank you, Rania. We acknowledge the Secretary General's call in his report for the urgent renewal of the social contract. Many youths worldwide feel excluded and marginalized from their international community and national systems of governance. How do you propose to ensure that youths are included in trust-building efforts identified as our defining challenge? Thank you.
Thank you everyone so much for your valuable inputs. I will now turn the attention to our senior leaders' reactions and comments. I would first like to give the floor to Mr. Turk for an allocated 4 minutes, and then Mrs. Wikramanayake. Mr. Turk, you may have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Pedro, and thanks also for your questions and for your contributions. I mean, because there's an overarching comment that some of you have mentioned, both when it comes to education, when it comes to work, when it comes to the future of work, but also when it comes to hunger and famine and issues around food. You know, COVID and the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, have really put back a number of the progress that we have achieved in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And those that have been particularly affected are the ones that you have mentioned: education, with a striking number of children not being able to go to school, and we will need to really find ways and means to ensure that that at least with next coming months and years that we fill that gap. The same on the vocational training side, as well as on the future of work. And we hope that the common agenda is a galvanizing point. It's really helping us to put new energy into the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, because they were, as you know, negotiated through a painstaking process that included a lot of stakeholders, but primarily then member states, and they negotiated it and they adopted it and they are committed to it. And we want to make sure that the common agenda sheds light on the absolute crucial need that the SDGs are implemented, and that's a very, very strong call. So it's not about reinventing the wheel. We have the SDGs. We need to make sure that they get implemented, especially in these areas, because education is almost cross-cutting, because we are not dealing with the education side and lifelong learning. We're not going to be able to deal with the green transition when we see that we need to look at the socio-economic systems around the world in a very different way, because as you know, from the climate change perspective, the jobs of the futures will be different than the ones that we have today, and that will require education, lifelong learning as a key game changer to achieve that particular transformation. And that's going to be extremely important. And we want to use the Transforming Education Summit next year precisely for that purpose. I mean, looking at all aspects of education, looking at education also in crisis situations. What does it mean? How do we make sure that education is not interrupted by conflict and violence? How can we make sure that the digital divide is not as big as it is today? How can we make sure that refugee children have access to not just primary education, but also to quality secondary education, and maybe using the technology that we have available to us in that respect? And that, I think, is also very much linked to opportunities for jobs. The International Labour Organization, you have probably seen some of the statistics. They have said that the transition to the green economy will create and generate jobs. And as a result, we need to accompany the process to ensure that vocational training is actually possible as a result. I think Jimena's question on the social contract an interesting one. The social contract is something organic. It sounds very static. Social contract. Well, actually, it is how society interacts, how society produces results, how society works to achieve something, how we are also engage with the institutions that are supposed to serve society and communities. And I think sometimes we forget that institutions, governments are there to serve people. That's where what's at the heart of the social contract. And it has to be built on trust. It has to be built on trust, not just between institutions and the populations, but also among populations. And what we have seen is a breakdown both in the trust that people have in their institutions that are supposed to serve them, but also a breakdown of trust among different parts and segments of the population. I think one of the biggest contributions to make is to go much deeper into a reflection of how to rebuild trust, how to overcome our own projections, how to overcome our own blind spots, if you like, or how to overcome our own shadow sides and see the other as the other and accept the other as the other and include and engage with the other, listen, engage, make sure that we are part and see that as part of what we need to do, as you are doing as youth delegates, but I'm sure also within your societies. So trust, I think, is the most important value that we need to really cherish, honor, validate, and reconquer in many ways, plus the whole aspect of participation, because trust cannot be done if there are segments of the population that are excluded or vilified or discriminated against. And that goes back to questions of race, it goes back to questions of gender, it goes back to questions of sexual orientation and gender identity. So we need that awareness that you as young people have so much more than some of us who have gone through some of these battles over the years. For us, for you, some of the things that are hard won are taken for granted, but you need to, in a way, show also to society as a whole that this inclusiveness, this participation, this self-awareness, this wanting to make sure that everyone can participate is actually a model for society as a whole to follow. So that's a big inspiration that we have seen from the youth movement, because you are so much more inclusive. You are not excluding, you're including. And in a way, society has to take a lesson from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turk. Now we will pass the floor to Mrs. Wickramanayake. Ms. Wickramanayake, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always very difficult to come after Walker, who I think is one of the smartest people working for the UN. Well, let me start with the question from Miriam. And I think it's also a question that I started asking myself a few weeks into my job as the youth envoy here. You know, I have a title as a Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. UN has been around for 70 plus years. And why are young people still suffering around the world? And why haven't we been able to find answers for those issues and address that suffering? And I found the answer in a quote that I saw when I was walking in a corridor of the UN, where the second UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, said, the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And that really got me thinking into what kind of approaches and what kind of solutions do we need if we are to not only apply plasters to wounds, but really to address the root causes of the problems that we are facing today. So the UN and its agencies, funds and programs can be around for 100, 200 years, addressing issues like hunger, education, doing projects and initiatives. But that will be merely to address the issue today and to save lives and provide an immediate response to save lives and make their lives better now. But the long-term solution really lies in what Volker said, in the reform of governance, in ensuring better representative governance in countries, in communities that bring homegrown solutions to the issues that the communities are facing. So as long as our countries are led by corrupt, non-transparent, colonialist, racist, patriarchal, majoritarian governments and leaders, we will not be able to find the sustainable solutions to these issues. So I think we have to also look at how do we bring sustainable systems change or reform to address issues in the long term, while of course trying to save lives and address the emergencies, particularly in humanitarian and conflict settings. And I think this also ties into the question on the social contract. And I think it's particularly important at a time where the trust between young people and governments and political institutions are at a record high gap. So how do we create platforms for young people to meaningfully participate in political processes? So going back to the Common Agenda, Secretary General talks there about initiatives happening in countries such as lowering the voting age, initiatives happening in countries such as removing legal restrictions that are there for young people to run for political office, looking at specific barriers that prevent young women from entering into political careers and political participation, challenges of refugee use, challenges of LGBTIQ plus young people, challenges of young people living with disabilities, minority youth, rural youth. And I think it's very important in the implementation process, when we design the exact steps of how we implement these initiatives, that we have a checklist that the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the voices that are furthest left behind are the ones to be first consulted and first integrated. So I think this also in a way contributes to rebuilding the trust with young people and the UN, with young people and governments, and with young people and the international system at large. And on the last question on accessibility, and I fully agree with the representative from the UK and what she said. I think language, disability and safety issues online has also made it difficult for young people to participate, particularly during the pandemic, in activities of the UN. But also one of the biggest issues for us has been ensuring the inclusiveness, reaching out to young people who do not have access to internet. So for an example, one of the approaches of my office is to make sure that the events that we do are accessible to young people, but also we allocate enough resources and funding in the beginning of the year, so that we can support the participation and make our events more democratized or more accessible for young people in all their diversity. But also recently we've conducted a series called Queer Youth Dialogues, where we engage with LGBTIQ young people who expressed their concern of getting involved in digital platforms. So for an example, in such cases, we've used text messaging or platforms that does not have a digital footprint in order to get their voices and their concerns heard as well. So all in all, what I wanted to say, if we are serious about sort of building trust and getting more young people involved in governance and in politics and bringing about this transformational social change that we are talking about, then we also need to create conducive environments and safe environments, and most importantly, be conscious about who we are leaving behind. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Vikramanayake, and I believe there are no better closing remarks than yours and Mrs. Turk's comments. And with that, I'd like to declare the ending of the first segment. I'd like to thank the senior leaders for their presence, the youth delegates and representatives that took part in this constructive dialogue, and of course my colleague Yona for moderating this segment with me. Without further ado, I'd like to invite everyone to join the second segment, and I pass the mic to my colleagues Simon and Stefania. Thank you.
Honorable guests, dear fellow delegates, my name is Stefania and I'm the Youth Delegates of Italy, and together with Simon, the Youth Delegate of Slovakia, we will moderate the second segment titled Ensuring Meaningful, Diverse and Effective Youth Engagement in the Work of the UN. I would like to thank the European Union for this great opportunity, and I also want to welcome again and thank senior leaders Ms. Jayatma Vikramanayake and Mr. Mohamed Siad Douale for their precious participation in this discussion. Our generation is strongly motivated to participate in the decision-making process, and we believe that we can contribute to social and economic development. As youth delegates, we are glad to represent youth voices from our country in the UN works, and we believe that the United Nations Delegate Programme is a significant starting point for growing attention to the role of youth. However, we want to share and discuss important points with you because we deeply believe that changing does not always mean improving, but to improve, you have always to change. So with this sentence, I want to leave the floor to my colleagues to present their joint statements. The first one is Ms. Cynthia Yu, Youth Observer of the United States of America. Please, Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steffi. Your Excellency, Mr. Chair of the Third Committee, Ms. Secretary General's Youth Envoy, and colleagues, we, the youth representatives to the United Nations, are gathered here today to discuss the critical importance of fortifying egalitarian youth participation and representation against the backdrop of an increasingly heterogeneous world. Ensuring equitable and inclusive representation in the UN Youth Delegate Programme is essential to carrying out our objectives outlined in our common agenda. To uplift a better tomorrow, we must address the inequities that exist between the global North and global South. We must address the systemic exclusion of certain youth in the policymaking process. We must address that the world is more than just the West, and as such, the UN Youth Delegate Programme must be more diverse. In all spaces, youth must not only have a seat at the table, but also have a chance to be heard. We have 6 requests for member states and the UN leaders. First, promote more representation from traditionally underrepresented communities. Second, amplify youth without tokenizing their presence. Third, support and fund the establishment of youth delegate programs in countries without them. Fourth, operate in more languages and include translators to increase participation from non-English speakers. Fifth, establish virtual youth delegate programs to increase youth participation from countries that cannot afford to support them to in person. And then 6, take into consideration the nuanced backgrounds, cultural differences, and identities of youth around the world when crafting language and goals related to youth empowerment. Hear our ideas and implement them. Ask not what the world can do for youth, but rather what youth can do for the world. And with that, I ask you 2 questions. Why were we, the youth delegates, not involved in the writing of the common agenda, despite it being so youth-focused? And how will you commit to ensuring diverse voices are actively being included in the UN's work moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Cinzia. I now want to leave the floor to Rashid Al-Rafi, the Youth Delegate of United Arab Emirates. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefania. Mr. Chair, distinguished briefers and colleagues. At the outset, allow us to thank the delegation of the European Union and the Office of the Envoy on Youth for convening the second UN Youth Delegates Dialogue on the margins of the Third Committee, and to our briefers for their insights. We welcome your commitment to engaging with youth delegates here today, especially as the entire world continues to recover and build back from the COVID-19 pandemic. The Our Common Agenda report presented by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres just weeks ago offers the recommendations for meaningful, diverse, and effective youth engagement, both within and outside of the United Nations. From our experience as youth delegates, we concur with the report's recommendations that better coordination and engagement between youth delegates in our program is required. While the UN General Assembly and its Third Committee in particular, and the Economic and Social Council, through its annual Youth Forum, have ensured consistent participation of youth delegates, we can do better to expand our presence and contribute constructively to a broader scope of high-level engagements. This includes high-level events on the margins of September's High-Level Week. We need to ensure a better contact system that allows for current and former youth delegates to communicate more efficiently with one another. The UN Youth Delegates Programme is an important network and should be better leveraged. A more coordinated group of youth delegates will undoubtedly strengthen outcomes and initiatives targeting young people. This will also enable current youth delegates to build on the work of their predecessors, allowing for improved continuity and consistency in progressing existing initiatives. To our panelists, we would like to hear your thoughts on who in the UN system would be best positioned to track and coordinate current and former members of the UN Youth Delegates Programme. This also includes a consistent focal point who could support youth delegate engagement beyond UN General Assembly activities. Additionally, what more can be done to promote and increase geographic representation in the UN Youth Delegates Programme? Finally, we commend the UNGA's Third Committee efforts in this matter, and we look forward to future dialogues that help close the gaps in the UN Youth Delegates Programme. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashid. I want now to leave the floor to Mr. Marco Demo, the Italian Youth Delegates. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefania. Your Excellency, Mr. Chair of the Third Committee, Mrs. Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. We really appreciate the increasing attention of the UN in the young generation's involvement, and we believe our program is potentially a solid possibility for enhancing meaningful, diverse, and effective youth engagement in UN works. The UN Youth Delegate Programme is a great opportunity. It is also true that the program could be further improved. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed several paradigms, including highlighting the crucial role of digital technologies and stressing the need to rethink structures and methods to be more connected in an inclusive way. As concrete proposal, we believe it's crucial to have a consolidated network among youth delegates. The UN could support this network to help the connection and turnover among representatives. A web platform where information about the present and former delegates, like contacts, activities, and countries' best practices are available would be a helpful improvement. Since we recognize the importance of all events proposed by the UN to ensure the meaningful participation of youth, a complete calendar with all upcoming events would be really useful. Indeed, on some occasions, we struggle to understand when, where, and which events are taking place, limiting our possibility to participate. It's commonly agreed that the UN have an articulated structure due to its crucial role in the global context. Some training activities about the UN working modalities could help us to contribute more effectively to all activities and bring more added value to our work in the international environment. While at the moment, we feel we are mainly learning by doing, that is not very formative. In conclusion, we think that networking, communication, and training are three urgent issues that could be improved. Indeed, while robust networking will allow us to share and connect with former and present delegates worldwide, more robust communication with UN offices would allow us to organize our participation within UN events, bringing our country's voices and collecting knowledge and experiences to bring back. To do this, a better knowledge of UN working modalities would help. We are sure that some small improvement could really boost our program, valorize our work, and truly ensure a meaningful, diverse, and effective engagement of youth delegates in the work of the UN. We thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I now want to pass the floor to Ms. Alicia Maldonado, the Youth Delegate of Peru. Please, Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Mr. Chair of the Third Committee, Ms. Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, dear colleagues. We welcome the development of the Youth Delegate Program by different member states. However, we are deeply concerned about the lack of representation of youth from the Global South, which can be historically evidenced by the small number of youth delegates to the UN coming from these countries. This is even more problematic as youth from the Global South makes up the majority of youth worldwide. Young persons in the Global South are facing the disproportionate effects of structural inequalities. In many cases, young people in the Global South are struggling to survive, as they are living the results of the decisions taken by the most powerful countries and industries. To become a youth delegate nowadays, it is imperative to be fluent in English, to dedicate enough time to the program as a volunteer, to have funds to travel to New York, or to have a stable internet connection. If it is implicitly mandatory to fulfill these requirements, a large majority of young persons, especially in the Global South, could never have the possibility to become a youth delegate. Furthermore, many countries in the Global South are not able to invest in the Youth Delegate Program. In the terms this program is developed, it is not ensuring adequate representation. Young persons are not to adapt to the UN. The UN is to adapt to the needs of young persons to make their voices heard. We recognize that we hold a privileged position now. We hope that being a youth delegate in the future does not represent a privilege, but rather an opportunity available to every young person that is willing to take the responsibility to represent youth in our countries. This is a challenge in which both the UN and member states should work together to enable meaningful and diverse youth representation. We would like to end with a final question in this regard. In which ways can UNDESA, the UN Youth Envoy, and member states promote implementation of the UN Youth Delegate Program and provide assistance to the countries, especially from the Global South, that have not yet implemented it? Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you for your speech. Now we'll proceed to the reactions of our senior guests. Therefore, I would like to give the stage to Your Excellency, Mr. Mohamed Siadoleh, the Chair of Third Committee. The floor is yours, Mr.
I thank you so very much for giving me this opportunity to react. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, the EU delegation to the UN and the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth for convening this dialogue. I also would like to sincerely thank the youth delegates for sharing the joint statements and welcome the many useful recommendations put forward. I'm most impressed by the energy, the enthusiasm, and the drive. Clearly, young people are eager and willing to play an active role in finding solutions to the biggest challenges of our time. This dialogue comes at a crucial time. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic, which is the largest crisis our world has ever seen since the Second World War. As an executive arm of the General Assembly, the Third Committee has the ability to put in motion political, economic, humanitarian, and social changes in our society. The ongoing pandemic has triggered pre-existing and challenging patterns of inequality and exclusion, as rightly pointed out by many of the speakers, which has also affected the largest youth population, currently standing at 1.8 billion. The economic impacts of COVID-19 are without precedent in modern history and explain how especially young people have been affected. I'd like to say a few words about the participation of youth delegates at the 76th session of the Third Committee of the General Assembly. It remains strong. As you are aware, the agenda of the committee comprises a range of critical issues such as human rights, as well as social issues impacting vulnerable groups in society, including women, children, indigenous peoples, and refugees. Areas of particular importance to youth include employment, education, and inclusion in decision-making. During the general debate of the committee held from December to October the 4th and October the 7th, 8 delegations had statements involving youth delegates. Speakers referred to the negative impact of the pandemic on the global South, including from economic, academic, and mental health perspectives, as well as the importance of action on gender equality and access to education, the meaningful civic participation of youth, and climate change. In addition, around 14 interventions were made by youth delegates participating in the virtual interactive dialogues with the special procedures, mandate holders, and other experts. During the interactive dialogues, numerous pertinent issues were discussed, including youth engagement to promote a life cycle approach to volunteering, youth empowerment and strengthening community resilience, restoring young people's trust in multilateralism. This is very crucial, as well as doing more to address the challenges faced by youth. Most of the youth delegates participated remotely through a virtual platform with a view to ensuring the maximum possible participation by representatives. The modalities agreed for the current session, once again, have provided an option for virtual, live, or pre-recorded video statements at the in-person formal meeting of the committee to hold the general debate. I'd also like to recall resolution 74/121 of December the 18th, 2019, by which the General Assembly, on the recommendation of the Third Committee, welcomed the effective participation of youth representatives in national delegations at the General Assembly, the ECOSOC and its functional commissions, and relevant United Nations conferences, and encouraged member states to include youth delegates in their delegations at all relevant discussions in the General Assembly and its subsidiary organs, the ECOSOC, and its functional commissions at relevant UN conferences, bearing in mind the principles of gender balance and non-discrimination, and emphasize that such youth representatives should be selected through a transparent process that ensures that they have a suitable mandate to represent young people in their countries. I also wish to recognize the strong focus on meaningful youth engagement in the UN 75 Declaration and subsequently Our Common Agenda report by the Secretary General. The Common Agenda, in my view, should be used as a tool to build back better while investing in intergenerational partnership with youth. Member states have, of course, an important role to play to make sure the agenda is implemented in close collaboration with a variety of stakeholders. I also wish to seize this opportunity to express support to the implementation of the UN system-wide youth 2030 strategy and the active and meaningful participation of young people in decision-making. This is an important tool that the UN, to ensure that the UN is fit for purpose and that the multilateral system at large works effectively with and for youth. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dola. Now I would like to yield the floor to Your Excellency, Mr. Jayatma Rikamanayake. The floor is yours, Ms.
Thank you, Simon. You can just call me Jayatma. Thank you very much for the chair of the third committee as well. Really great to see the chair participating and listening to the youth delegates. So there were a lot of questions, but I think maybe I'll put them into three baskets. The first one was on the common agenda, young people's involvement in the common agenda, and the specific question on why were youth delegates not involved in the common agenda. The second one was more on meaningful engagement of young people in the UN's processes in general. And the last one was the representation, access, and support to the Youth Delegates Programme. So on the first question, as I said also in my opening remarks, the Common Agenda was a very inclusive consultative process that ran through a few months of consultation. There were 4 tracks that contributed to the report, which were the Member States track, the Young Thinkers track, and the thought leaders track and the civil society track. And all these tracks had their modality of working. The young thinkers track particularly was led by a group of young fellows that were supported by also the UN Foundation, who conducted wide consultations that fed into the Secretary General's report, but also there were consultations with member states. And I personally remember that some of the consultations that I participated in, there were youth delegates participating and contributing, particularly also in the breakfast dialogues that were hosted during the process of the common agenda. So I think there were many opportunities during the public consultations and also through the member state involvement for youth delegates to participate. And if you did not have an opportunity to participate in that stage, you now have an opportunity to participate in the implementation stage. And I really also encourage you to find ways to contribute. Let us know as well what are the specific areas and specific contributions that you can make as youth delegates to advance the implementation of these recommendations. And we will be more than happy to work in partnership with you to make sure that you, together with the other groups and constituencies of young people, are informed and are engaged in the work that we do. Broadly on the engagement of young people and the meaningful engagement of young people in the work of the UN, so the work that I engage in the UN happens at two levels. One happens at an intergovernmental level, particularly the ones that you as youth delegates participate. So the negotiations, the intergovernmental deliberations, and based on those negotiations and those decisions, the UN in its funds, programs, agencies, and the Secretariat, we implement specific programs and initiatives to implement those resolutions and decisions. So while encouraging more youth participation in the intergovernmental work, we have also internally tried to integrate youth also in the implementation of these decisions and resolutions. For an example, if you take Youth 2030, the United Nations Youth Strategy, the Youth 2030 is governed by a high-level steering committee that is made of the UN agencies that are responsible for the implementation of this youth strategy. And this high-level steering committee, we currently have 2 seats dedicated for civil society youth representatives and 1 seat dedicated for young people working inside the UN. And I can without a doubt say that this is the most representative steering committee or a guiding committee that we have within the UN to implement a specific strategy in the UN. And we continue to also look at ways of making it more expanded, of course, practical in ways that practically possible, and getting more voices directly from young people to contribute, to advise, and to guide the UN on the ways that we implement the youth strategy going forward. We've also included young people in the monitoring and evaluation process of the strategy. So as you know, we have a scorecard that tracks the implementation of the strategy across the 131 UN country teams, and young people have contributed to drafting the indicators of that strategy and also helped us analyze this data and present the report at the COSOC Youth Forum in April this year. So rest assured that through the work that we are leading and we are continuing, we will have young people at the driving seat as designers of the initiatives that we come up with, together co-create and co-implement them with young people, and also engage young people in the monitoring and evaluation processes of those various initiatives. Lastly, in terms of who in the UN system is better suited to support young people, youth delegate program, how do we increase the representation and how do we support more representation from the global South? I think, first of all, the mandate of the Youth Delegate Program is given to a specific department in the Secretariat by a third committee resolution. However, we work very closely with them, but we also work very closely with member states and youth delegates to advocate within the limitations of my mandate to increase the number of youth delegates that are participating in UN processes. For an example, when I conduct country missions and when I have meetings with government representatives, it's definitely one of the points that I bring up, giving them also ideas and tools to start youth delegate programs if they do not have one, and to increase the efficiency and the meaningful representation of the programs that they currently have. And I've also in the past years supported civil society youth organizations who wanted to work with their governments to create youth delegate programs. So for an example, I've written to numerous ministers of foreign affairs during the last 4 years, encouraging them to start UN Youth Delegate programs, but also to politically and financially support the sustenance of those Youth Delegate programs as well. And of course, we continue to also advocate with donors to continue funding and supporting the trust fund that is established to support youth delegates. However, I also understand that currently there are no contributions that are being made to this trust fund. So in my mandate of advocacy, I continue to advocate for the expansion of the Youth Delegate Program, but also its increased geographical representation of particularly youth delegates from the global south. Lastly, what I want to say is, for an example, the consultations on the common agenda, the various meetings that we have here at the UN, particularly at an intergovernmental level, this information flows through member states. And I think most of the time as the UN, we channel this information to countries through their missions here in New York. So I also encourage you and recommend you to strengthen your communication and your coordination with the missions in New York, because they are our primary point of contact when it comes to informing member states about the various initiatives that are going on. And I think so far, some of the member states have been really very active and proactive in terms of making sure youth delegates are present in almost every meeting, either it is a formal meeting of the UN or even in informal consultations. But I think still within the limited number of youth delegates that we have, their participation can be improved. And lastly, I think there is, and to be very, very frank also with you, I think there is also a limit to what the UN can do, because this is not a UN program. This is a program of member states that is coordinated and supported by the United Nations. So selecting youth delegates and their participation and their level of participation, are they observers, are they negotiators, can they attend meetings? These all have to be decided by the member state. And as the UN, we can advocate for this representation and for this access. But of course, at the end of the day, this decision lies with your ministers of foreign affairs and your missions here in New York. So again, my recommendation is to also continue to work together, work in close coordination, and have strong ongoing communication with your colleagues and counterparts here in New York to ensure that this information flow is also there.
Thank you, Jayatma, for your response. As youth delegates, we are here to help not only with the implementation of our common agenda, but also, as you mentioned, with helping to monitor the progress and evaluate the progress itself. So we're here to serve the youth from our countries, and we'll be happy to help. Moving on to the Q&A session, I would like to yield the stage to Mr. Ayeojin Kim from the Republic of Korea. Ayeojin, the stage is yours.
Hello, honorable guests. It's an honor to be speaking today as one of the youth delegates of the Republic of Korea. So my experience with the UN Youth Delegate Program was actually quite difficult, because I was only allowed to see the internal workings and the plans after being accepted as a youth delegate. So this made it a challenge to keep up with the activities and all the meetings of the other members. So based on my experience, my suggestion is that the youth program should be simplified, not more complicated than it is. For example, developers can only spend so much time and effort making a smartphone application. Thus, sometimes the individual users of the app come forward to fix problems and inconveniences in the system. And the way that the developers can help these users improve the app is by making it open sourced. Nowadays, more people than ever are using their voices to make incredible changes to the world. Accordingly, I think it's paramount that instead of a closed invitation-only space for the elite members of the youth, we should create an open source space for everyone to share their ideas and improvements. Therefore, my questions are, what are your thoughts on this method? And has this kind of open group ever been attempted in the United Nations before? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayeojin. And now I would like to yield the floor to Ms. Talia Pourret and Mr. Tom Levy from Israel. Tom and
Thank
Talia,
you, Simon.
the floor is yours. Sorry.
Thank you, Simon. Dear delegates, distinguished panelists, we all agree that the current arrangement regarding youth participation in general and youth delegates in particular is not enough. Ever since COVID-19 started, youth participation has been declining to a dangerous place where programs are closing and new delegates are being pushed to the margins. In this GA, we met amazing youth delegates who, like us, push for meaningful participation by youth delegates. However, as always, a change will come only if we all decide that we need a new deal, a fresh start. I would like to ask our panelists, what could be such a new deal regarding youth participation at the UN? And how could the UN regulate it and normalize the Youth Delegate Program across states? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to yield the floor to Lucia Carneluti from Slovenia. Lucia, the floor is yours.
This year, we are celebrating an important milestone, the 40th anniversary of the Youth Delegate Program, where we can witness, even in today's dialogue, that youth delegates are more than ever eager to co-shape this program and add valuable insights to their national delegations and other bodies of the UN. Yet, in the past 2 years of the ongoing pandemic, when voices of young people should be heard and valued the most, many of the youth delegates and youngsters overall were not able to fully participate in decision-making processes that either directly or indirectly affected their futures. As we move forward, I believe it is important we also look back in the past and dedicate some time to evaluation and assessment of the program in the last 40 years, which can ensure that certain obstacles and problems, many of which we also heard today, and disruptions in the system, like the one due to the pandemic, won't come up again. So the fellow delegates and our honorable speakers, do you believe that a structured assessment on all levels and bodies included in the Youth Delegate Program would be beneficial for the future work of this program? And how do you think we could all contribute to it and carry it out successfully? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again for your contribution. Now we're returning to our guests as back. And now I would like to yield the floor to Your Excellency, Mr. Mohammed Ziadola.
Oh, thank you once again for giving me the floor. And I'd like to thank the youth delegates for their insightful questions, the commitment displayed, but most importantly, the very useful suggestions that were just made. Shaping and designing the future we want is a joint endeavor, one in which the youth has a critical role to play. The obligation to ensure a safer and better world was a powerful motivator when our leaders created the United Nations. After all, the UN was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This obligation to take care of the best interests of future generations is even more urgent as we continue to face a number of existential threats. The role of the committee is to address critical issues through collaboration and consensus. This work is paramount to strengthening the trust of people, especially young people, in the UN system and in multilateralism. Youth delegates have an important role to play in this regard, acting as a connector between young people and youth, civil society at national level, and the discussions and decision-making processes at the United Nations. As rightly pointed out by many speakers, the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged participation for many groups in society due to issues such as increased financial instability, lack of stable internet accessibility, imposed restricted movement regimes. It is indeed important that this does not become a new normal. The work of the UN is dependent on collaboration and input across sectors, stakeholders, and generations. It is welcome news that the UN exploring more innovative ways of including youth voices and investing in wide-scale consultations as those that fed into the UN 75 declaration. The ECOSOC Youth Forum is another good example of a modality to harness the ideas and solutions developed by young people around the world. I wish to take this moment to commend the Secretary General's Youth Envoy, who's working hard together with partners across the system and member states to enhance this agenda. We just heard a progress report and also the amount of work that she did to make sure to expand the Youth Delegate Program and also meaningfully engage with member states, even at capitals. I'm also pleased to see the recognition and continued importance of this work expressed in the Secretary General Our Command Agenda Report, and take note of the specific ask for the Youth Envoy to develop recommendations for the General Assembly, ECOSOC, and Security Council and its subsidiary bodies on how to increase meaningful youth participation. We will, of course, be following this work closely in the months to come. The meaningful inclusion of youth perspectives from youth civil society as well as youth delegates remain a priority in the important work of the third committee. We can, of course, do better to expand the presence and contributions of young people in high-level engagement. We had some very useful ideas in that regard. Young people, including youth delegates who are parts of official member state delegations to the UN, should continue conveying key messages to the United Nations and its bodies, such as the Third Committee of the General Assembly. Youth delegates are important contributors to the work of the committee, as we are seeing now in ongoing negotiations on the youth resolution. As the chair of the Third Committee, I finally would like to seize this opportunity to encourage member states to continue supporting the Youth Delegate Programme while ensuring diversity, accessibility, and inclusivity of the program. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the reply. And last but not least, from our segment, I would like to yield the floor to Jayatma. Jayatma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. On the first question on open meetings, I mean, this is what I said earlier as well. In places where sort of we have or my office or my mandate has the power to decide how the meetings are held, then of course we try to do them as democratic and as representative as possible. So for an example, ECOSOC Youth Forum is an open source. Any young person who is interested to attend can register and attend. The UN 75 Town Hall we hosted, the Youth Climate Summit, the Young Leaders Program that my office has attracts more than 8,000 young people, for an example, for to every 2 years for the program. So the initiatives that we design together with young people and we lead in the implementation, of course, we try to make them as open, as representative, as accessible as possible for every young person to participate. But I think if your question is about if the intergovernmental processes can be open and public, or if the negotiations can be open and public, I think that is a question for maybe my EU ambassador Ulf, who might want to give an answer to that, or third committee chair, particularly on the intergovernmental process, because this is not something that as UN Secretariat or staff that we have the power to decide. And again, on the Youth Delegate Program, I think I hear your concern, and I really do sympathize with you on some of the challenges that you've been facing in terms of getting this information. And I think also probably the COVID-19 pandemic and lack of communication and not being here in person might have impacted it even more, even though youth delegates generally have issues when it comes to accessing information, sometimes due to lack of communication with their capitals or with their missions. This was my experience. Also, when I was youth delegate, I was Sri Lanka's first youth delegate back in 2012. So I am familiar and I can sympathize with many of the challenges that you were talking about. I think while the nuance is still there, whereas the UN, we cannot dictate to sovereign member states who they include and do not include in their delegations, still we will continue to advocate, as I said, using the various methods of advocacy that we have to increase the representation of youth delegates, particularly from the Global South, at the different parts of the UN's work, particularly also not only the third committee, but also in the Security Council, in the Human Rights Council, at the climate negotiations that are happening right now at the COP, because it's important that young people are not only here to talk about youth in the third committee, but their voices are actually integrated in other dialogues and other conversations and other negotiations as well. And again, my plea to you is to continue to use the privilege that you have, or the seat that you have, to advocate for the same objectives and to continue to raise the voices and concerns of your peers who cannot be here today and who can who can claim their space. So it is only through joint advocacy and a joint commitment that we can create more and more spaces and make these dialogues more inclusive and more representative of the true diversity of young people around the world. On the last specific question on evaluation, I encourage you to also communicate this to the relevant departments and offices that are coordinating the Youth Delegate Program. But I will give you my full commitment that within the parameters of my mandate, I will continue to advocate for stronger participation of youth delegates in the work of the UN, but also to increase their representation geographically and in diversity in all UN processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayatma, for your understanding and your empathy as well. Moving further on, I would like to pass the stage or pass the floor to Matthew and Manel, who will be moderating the third segment. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, all colleagues, and thank you, panelists. We almost reached the end of this event, so let me present to you our joint statement. We were currently celebrating the 40th anniversary of Resolution 3617, which officially enabled the inclusion of youth representatives in national delegations to the United Nations. And while it may seem as a big milestone, we're unfortunately still a long way from having meaningful youth inclusion in the United Nations. And this has been clearly demonstrated through the words of my fellow colleagues, who have all provided you with insights into the situation and the disappointing reality that oftentimes the young people of this world are still being excluded and are not given the opportunity to meaningfully participate. What we wish to propose through this joint statement is not the creation of a separate table. We don't want our voices to be heard in a separate room. Quite the contrary. We suggest the inclusion of intergenerational dialogues in order to tackle the intergenerational problems that we face. And we want to do that via this declaration. We all share the same common agenda. And in the spirit of this cooperation, we as the United Nations Youth Delegates from across the world have come together and combined our forces to produce this youth declaration. And this document is the culmination of our statements, our critique, but most important, our proposed solutions. Instead of waiting by the sidelines for it to be our turn, we came together to create a statement in which youth participation can be reached meaningfully, and which will suggest solutions for the problems that we're collectively facing.
As UN Youth Delegates, we have a responsibility to represent the youth in our countries, and have noted that we are unable to live up to that responsibility in the most deserving manner possible. Since this program is one that enables youth participation to be meaningfully achieved, through this declaration we have identified certain key issues that we believe ought to be addressed in order for this program to operate in its intended manner. Firstly, we note the limited recognition of this program within the organizational frameworks of the UN, and the fact that the inconsistent coordination of this program is leading to a lack of standardization in the way member states run the United Nations Youth Delegate Programme. Secondly, we recognize a lack of communication and exchange of information between key stakeholders of the United Nations Youth Delegate Programme, including UNDESA and the permanent missions of the member states. Thirdly, we identify the need for an official onboarding process for incoming United Nations Youth Delegates, including the development of an effective training scheme and access to adequate resources. Fourth of all, we address the lack of funding and the lack of an allocated budget provided for the United Nations Youth Delegate Programme. However, we have also collectively devised solutions to the issues we are facing and hope that these will enable the improvement of the program and will render it more effective. An example includes the creation of a centralized UN office that is mandated to coordinate the United Nations Youth Delegate Programme, which can be held responsible for the funding, the provision of relevant sources of information, and training programs for the United Nations Youth Delegates. Funding is important to make sure that there is an equal access to the Youth Delegate Programme. We know that while the current United Nations Youth Delegate Programme is aimed towards identifying and fighting inequalities faced by youth, a lack of funding is creating new ones, with certain underrepresented areas lacking access to this programme. Moreover, the exchange of information, the provisions of resources, and the development of a training program will enable the effective performance of youth delegates, will better prepare the United Nations Youth Delegates to tackle their duties, and will create a baseline of experiences, making all of us equal. As United Nations Youth Delegates, We believe that the meaningful contribution and participation of youth ought to be a pillar embedded within the systemic functioning of the United Nations. The improvement of the United Nations Youth Delegate Programme is one manner which will allow us to achieve this and will better equip us to address the issues forming part of our common agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you two. Sadly, we have arrived at the end of our event. Now I will hand over once again to the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth to give her the chance to react to the joint declaration and to present some remarks. From our side, we just really want to thank all the high-level speakers who took time out of their busy schedules to listen to the voice of youth. And we would especially like to give a big thanks to all the youth delegates and activists who participated and made this event possible today. Jatna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Franca. Thank you again for the declaration. I look forward to also reading it and discussing with my UN counterparts how we implement your very important recommendations. And I've heard loud and clear sort of your concerns and things that you think can be improved. And we will surely, from the side of the UN, try to maximize, at least from my office, we will try to maximize what we are doing right now in order to support you in the best possible way. Let me just maybe be a little bit politically incorrect here and give you a different perspective. I understand your ask and I understand what you're saying, but I think you have to also be careful for what you're asking for. Because I think you should not try to distinguish yourselves too much away from your national delegations and from member states and create a separate constituency of youth delegates. I think your strength is being a part of your government's delegation, being a part of your mission here, being able to go into rooms where other young people of civil society cannot go, being able to talk and make your point in rooms where even I, as a UN staff, cannot go and cannot access. So you have a specific power being a representative of member states and being a youth delegate. And I think it's important in what you are asking for that you do not lose that, sorry, I think somebody's microphone is on. That you do not lose this independence and the power and the influence that you get as youth delegates by being a part of member states. Because what you're asking for an example, is very similar to the fellowship program that I have, where we recruit young people, train young people, and they come and speak or they contribute to something at the UN, and then they, leave after the fellowship program. But your role is very different. You're like, you're delegates, So I think it's important that you assert that power and use that power and that special independence and hybrid role that you have as youth delegates. But of course, if you need a specific training and specific information, I understand that communication has to be better between the UN and your governments and youth delegates, and these has to be improved in terms of process. But the identity of program, I would say it's important to be careful of what you ask for, because it will be a loss to lose that special power that you have by being youth delegates to influence your own government and the UN through your governments. Just wanted to say that being a youth delegate myself, because I think that is the niche and the importance of the youth delegate program vis-a-vis, say, a civil society youth representation or a youth leader or a young fellow that we recruit and train and get us to help with the youth programs at the UN. Anyway, I just wanted, because we are running out of time, thank again the EU ambassador, his delegation, and the youth delegates who played a key role in shaping this dialogue. I know it took us a while, but I think that's the importance of participatory approach. And this is exactly how we want the common agenda to be implemented. Young people leading the way, formulating the programs and projects together with us, implementing them together with us, and of course, reviewing them and improving and evaluating them together with us as well. Thank you again for your commitment. Please continue to stay engaged. And if you need any specific information, you have my email and social media. Feel free to reach out anytime. Thank you.